you very much for
Great, thank you. Wonderful to be here, and what a great list of folks who are here. Many of you I've met and I'm collaborating with in one way or another, and it's really great to see this issue get so much traction and interest. So in the interest of time, and actually let me just set my timer here for 15 minutes. I'm just going to get going. So I'm going to talk today about the research that I've been doing with colleagues on 4-day weeks and what we're doing on. Oh, I forgot to share my screen. Hold on a second. What we're doing on carbon issues. So let me. Okay, let me just say that this is often challenging with my double screens, and let me swap. So are you seeing a good screen with just the slide?
Perfect.
Excellent. So here we go. The first slide really needs no, I don't think I need to say much except that this is the backdrop, which is the urgent need for very, very extreme, deep, whatever we want to call them, reductions in emissions beginning now. And I guess the point I would make here is that the sort of business as usual strategies, which are really just focused on technology, i.e. energy sources, have proven insufficient. So we really need to start thinking about other things. And what I'm going to be thinking about today, and I guess all of us are, is how reducing working hours can contribute to an emissions pathway that is, will get us to a safer place. So, just one point, and for anyone who reads in this literature, this is not a surprise. All of the post-growth models, or if we want to call them degrowth models or steady state models or whatever it is, require reductions in hours, because if we are not taking up productivity growth with shorter hours, and if you're not expanding the size of the economy, then unless you have shrinking population, which of course some countries do, but with climate migrants, probably less and less likely, you've got to do something about working hours. So whether we're talking about Jackson and Victor's model, that's the one I have a picture from here, low grow, or the Euro Green model, or pretty much any model, just even basic common economic reasoning leads us to the need for reduced hours. And here, just to remind us that we are in a world with growing productivity pretty much across all countries. Some have lower, higher, but that dynamic of constant increases in productivity suggests that if you are going to limit the growth of output, whether it's intentionally as in a post-growth or a degrowth scenario, or maybe just because you can't figure out how to increase the size of your economy that much, which is a little bit where Europe is at, you've got to do something about that, those hours, that growing output per hour. So here we have, just to remind ourselves, a picture of annual hours per worker for this selection of countries. I think what's worth mentioning here is that although there are some countries which have had, fairly substantial reductions in hours, and of course the Netherlands and Germany and France to a lesser extent, although not so much recently. If you look post-2000, French hours really haven't fallen much. They have had larger increases, but there are other countries such as my own, the United States, Sweden, more recently has had some ups and downs in terms of its hours, some periods where hours aren't falling. You can see here also Spain, a bit of a leveling out. Not every country is really following a trajectory of reduced working hours. And here, if you just look at the very last column here, it's the fraction of productivity which has been taken in shorter hours over the period 73 to 2019. And you can see those first two countries, US and UK, have taken a very small fraction of their productivity growth in the form of shorter hours. Spain also relatively on the low side, Australia on the low side, Sweden. And so this is really longer term the way to think about reducing working hours, taking productivity in the form of shorter hours of work. But what I'm going to talk to you about now is the research that we've been doing on companies that are giving their employees 4-day work weeks, so reducing work time typically by 20% from a 5 to a 4-day week, most of them on official schedules of 40 hours with no reduction in pay. And this is a little bit different than what I've been talking about so far, because taking productivity in the form of shorter hours is really about trading income for time. But what's happening here is that these companies, for the most part, are making up the productivity. So they're actually increasing productivity at the same time that they're reducing work hours. And I'll say a bit more about that. So just a couple of points about why is it that companies are doing this. The pandemic is really the catalyzing factor. Not many were reducing to a 4-day week before. These are US data, but a lot of these are also true across the globe. The pandemic led to increased levels of stress, worry, anger, sadness, the so-called Great Resignation in the US, lots and lots of people leaving their jobs. US searches for burnout from work just soared during the pandemic. So-called engagement scores have declined, disengagement rising, they call it quiet quitting, and unfilled job vacancies. So this tight labor market with high levels, historic really levels of quits, unfilled positions, and so forth, is leading employers to try and think about ways other than just raising wages to try and attract people. So the 4-day week is very popular. This is a US study. In the UK, also very popular. And for those of you who have followed our work, you'll know our largest trial was in the UK with about 70 companies participating. And the UK has a very robust 4-day week movement. So our research came out of an experience of an entrepreneur in New Zealand whose company Perpetual Guardian organized a 4-day week trial with what they call the 100-80-100 model. 100% of the pay, 80% of the work time, but workers figure out in collaboration how to get 100% of the work done. We began with our first trial in 2022. The trials involve 2 months of coaching and onboarding to help companies figure out how to stay as productive in 4 days as they were in 5. And then the 6 months, and virtually all of them could have been continuing after the 6 months. And I'll show you some of the results at 12 months. They have to maintain their pay at 100. We don't require absolutely that they go to 32, but the vast majority are. So we have 7 cohorts who have finished now. We're just about to start another cohort. So we've got thousands of employees. We have probably about 200 companies now, including those signed up for the next group. And they are across North and South America. We have a Brazilian cohort starting, Africa, Europe, and Oceania. We are tracking a variety of things. We have an employer survey where we're getting administrative data from them, an employee survey with 4 waves at baseline, 3 months, 6 months, and 12 months, a time use diary for the off day, which we administer at month 3, and then pre and post. We're just starting the pre-trial interviews. We've mostly been doing post-trial so far. Key findings, I'll just say a word or two about this, then get into the energy and climate findings. So these are from 12 months. One of the things you see is it takes them a little bit of time to get those hours down from a baseline of 38 down to 33. And these are for, I think, all of the companies as of a month ago that had finished 12 months. It's not a speed up. You see here that work intensity really isn't rising. So the companies are really figuring out how to get more efficient. Big reductions in burnout. Something like about 70% across our global sample of thousands of workers now experience a reduction in burnout. They have improvements in physical health, in mental health, in life satisfaction, in job satisfaction, in their work-life balance. And this is where we ask them to rate the overall experience. So all of these effects are statistically significant from baseline to the 6-month point, and also from baseline to the 12-month, where you get a little bit of the significance level here is for the 6 to 12. And in there, the results are a little bit mixed. So for example, something like mental health continues to go up, but job satisfaction falls back a bit. So there's a little bit of a mixed picture, but very small and typically not significant differences between 6 and 12, which is really important because we were concerned that maybe this was just a novelty thing, and that as people settle into this schedule, they get used to it and those well-being effects dissipate, but that appears not to be the case. Okay, measuring emissions. I don't have a lot of time left. Very difficult. We need to think about reductions in commuting, electricity and heating and cooling at the companies as well as the households, changes in household behaviors, travel rebound. Are the people cooking and having healthier diets, which reduces their footprint? Unanticipated impacts of companies closing one day. Some companies don't close. Turns out my head is breaking because there's so much to think about here. So we started by thinking, all right, let's get energy use data from the companies and the households, and also ask the households about travel, which is a key factor. We were really worried about those travel rebounds because most of these people are getting 3 days off together, so they could jet off, especially in Europe for 3-day holidays. Focus on the big things, which is the household energy use and travel. But not all the companies could give us energy use data. Some of them don't actually pay their own utilities. Some of them are remote. They don't pay them because they're so small. Some of them didn't close. Some of them do close. And the household energy use turned out to be very messy. We're dealing with multiple fuel sources. We asked for their dollar, their bills in their local currencies, not their actual usage, because we didn't think people would go back to look at their bills and give us the kilowatt hours. Dealing with big seasonal effects. We started the first trial in February and it ended in June. Well, of course, they're going to be traveling more in June, and figuring out what those seasonality factors are is complicated and difficult. We're dealing with so many different countries. They'll have different seasonality. And then you had the big price increases in energy at the time from the Ukraine war happening. So it just so many issues. This is all we've gotten to. And we did do some of those analyses, but we're not really that confident about them, sort of trying to figure out, say, for the household energy use and the companies. We added a self-rated personal carbon footprint to some of the later trials. And what we found there is pretty much not much change there. No statistically significant change from baseline to endpoint in terms of how people think about their carbon footprint. We asked whether they walk or cycle instead of using the car. And this varies by trial, but a little bit of an increase you see from 3 to 3.1. So statistically significant. Most people, it's stable, and sort of equal numbers of this is the fraction of the sample for whom it fell, stayed the same or rose. I'm trying to get my cursor back over here. We asked about volunteering for the environment. We asked a few more environmental behavior questions that were no change in any of those. The more important thing is commute time per week, which does fall quite a bit. And then percentage commuting by car. So a small decline in that, very small. Domestic travel has fallen on average. So that's not, we're not getting a domestic travel rebound. And it doesn't seem like there's much of an international travel rebound. So for the most part, not an increase in that and less domestic travel happening. So that's all positive from the point of view of footprint. One more thing is
I am so sorry. We are running out of time. If you could.
Yes, this is my last slide. Yeah.
Thank you.
Time use on the off day. Mostly people are staying close to home and getting involved in leisure activities, housework, personal maintenance, hobbies. So we're not seeing much transportation. We did ask about retrospectively. Oh, I forgot about this one. Maybe a little bit of an increase in energy use. So I'll just stop there, and we can talk about the questions that we have and sort of thinking about how to move this kind of research forward with this kind of data.
Thank you very much. It was hard to interrupt there because it's very, very interesting. I have not seen this type of research before, so it feels very novel, very exciting. I'm gonna then hand over to our second speaker, Methab. Did you have slides you wanted to share?
Yes, I will.
Perfect. Thank you. I'll give you as well 15 minutes.
Yes. Are you able to see them?
You can make them larger because at the moment we see...
Is it okay now?
Now we see it from a presenter view. It might be worth to go into view and then just remove the presenter view.
Does that look better?
At the moment, it works. We can see. Yeah, we're back to presenter view. So
that's very strange. I don't understand. I'm sorry.
Well, no, it's fine. I think we can just use the one you had before, where we see some of the. Yeah, this works fine.
Okay, sorry. Okay, so thanks very much for. It's an honor also to be in the same panel.
Sorry, now we're seeing just the background of your.
Oh no.
Maybe it's viewing the wrong screen.
I don't know. So what do you see now?
Now we see your PowerPoint.
I'm afraid to touch the full screen and you see something else. Shall we stay with this? Is it too annoying?
Well, yeah, no, this works fine.
Okay, thank you. Sorry for this technical thing. Yeah, so it's an honor really to be in this panel also with Juliet. It's going to be a lot of déjà vu for her. I'm sorry for that, but basically I will be complementing what's been presented because I will be looking at the macro level situation. So looking at the impact on the environment as a response to work hours reduction at the cross-country level and using some econometric approach. So, and you're able to see my second slide, right? It's moving. Okay.
Yes.
Okay. So, so the thing here, I'll try to be as brief as possible and quickly bring you to the results and the estimates and so on. But so basically, the thing with this research was working time, research on working time and environmental research has often or for a long time developed separately or independently. Only in recent times there has been rising interest to look at it jointly, and that's also thanks to the availability of comparable cross-country data sets. And the focus has so far been on the advanced economies, with some comparison between the US and Europe. And some papers have focused more on methodological aspects. And what I will be doing here is to basically, in a way, replicate one of Juliet's previous papers and increase and change a bit the country coverage with more recent data and some extension of the existing framework, which I won't have a lot of time, I think, to describe all of it, but at least some flavor of what's going on with this. So the theoretical framework, I think I'm gonna skip most of it. It's based on the environmental impact modeling framework, where we can model the environmental impact as a multiplicative form, where the effects are the control variables are population, affluence, and technology, and we have ways to measure them. And with a bit of algebraic reformulation, we end up, I again go fast on this, but I'm happy to go back if there are any questions later on. We end up with an estimating equation where we could estimate the impact on working hours, which is one of the control variables on the right-hand side, to see the impact on the environment. And environmental impact could be measured by emissions, ecological footprint, energy use, etc., etc. So some way of understanding pressures on our ecosystem. And here this equation 3 is my main estimating equation, and the coefficient in front of the working hours, average working hours per employed, is going to be the coefficient of interest that will summarize that relationship between hours and the environment. I'll basically estimate this equation in a regression framework using cross-country panel data. I'll be looking at EU countries, plus Norway, Switzerland, and UK, and over the last 6 decades. And I'll be using various controls also for the years effects, as you know, things are changing over time, as well as we'll have time invariant fixed effects to capture some heterogeneity across countries that are not changing over time. The data sources are quite the usual kind of known ones. The main macroeconomic variables like GDP, population, share of employed comes from pan-world tables. I use the same source for the annual hours work as Juliet's paper, and I use the one from the Conference Board. The environmental variables I'll be looking at for the emissions, the carbon dioxide emissions from the global carbon budget. I've also checked the robustness of the results with the EU EDGAR database. And then I'll also look at the carbon and total footprint from Global Footprint Network. And the fourth one, I didn't write it here, it's the energy use that is coming from the World Bank dataset. That's also another indicator on the environment environmental impact. So some descriptive graphs to a little bit complement what Juliet already said, that so this is the average hours work for the 6 decades that I've looked at. So it doesn't say much. What you see here says a bit more. Basically, what Juliet has also said, that the average working hours are decreasing over decades. So each graph is a decade, and this is the average working hours distribution across the sample of countries that I'm looking at. There's a significant shift towards the left of the distribution, so less working hours are decreasing over time. So that's also what we saw in some of the graphs that Juliet showed. And as she again showed, we didn't cross-check our slides before, so we have some overlapping information in our pictures, but different pictures, but same message, that while working hours decreased over time over the last decades, the average productivity per hour has increased, so we became more productive and we work less hours. So, and how about the environmental indicators? How did they evolve over time. So the carbon emissions, this is an average picture. So there could be, of course, deviation from this picture, average picture, if you look at single countries. So it has increased sharply until 80s and then more or less stable with ups and downs and more downs towards 2020. That's the average energy use per capita over time. Somewhat similar picture as the emissions. So sharp increase, but yeah, with a little bit ups and downs more recent times. This is the average total footprint. Here I was trying to understand why I have this drop in 2000, around 1990, and that's because the sample of countries have suddenly got larger with the dissolution of the Soviet Union, because this is EU, so some of the countries were not officially measured in this data set up to that point. So as from, let's say, 20, you went to 30 countries, the average dropped. So that's pure sample kind of, augmentation because of political, let's say, events taking place. So this is a totally descriptive picture. It's not an outcome of estimation result, but it will just to little bit understand this whether do we see a sort of environmental Kuznets curve. So the Kuznets curve is basically measuring whether the inequalities were rising with or how do they evolve with the income. So I wanted to replicate this because there has been some quest about whether this is also observed for environmental indicators, and there seems to be especially for emissions, sort of like a first rise in emissions as incomes grow, and then maybe a slight decline when the income is like pretty high. But again, nothing, no hard claims here. It's just some descriptive picture of what might maybe happen. So maybe for future research to be investigated more in detail. So now I think I have like 5 minutes, or do I have 5 minutes, or less than 5 minutes?
Okay, so you have 7 minutes.
Oh, perfect. Okay, so then even better. I'm presenting you now the regression results of the model, the framework that I described in the beginning. So because I thought it's nicer to see pictures of the estimates rather than tables, at least to change a bit the way of visualization of the results. I'm presenting you a limited version of it, but with the main coefficient of interest of how basically this is the picture, the first line, the first dot with the confidence interval. So the line is the confidence interval, summarizing the relationship between hours work and the dependent variable, which is emissions. So how do I read this picture? Remember the equation that I estimated was a logarithmic equation. So the estimates, the coefficients are actually could be interpreted as elasticities, as percentages. So this to be read as if we increase average hours work by 1%, the emissions holding out everything else constant in this equation will increase by nearly 4%, or a bit less than 4%, because it's a little bit lower than 4%. And controlling for other variables in the equation. So that's quite significant. And this is a similar picture for the other dependent variable, which is the carbon footprint. Here, the coefficient is a bit smaller than the other one, but still quite significant because the confidence intervals are still to the right of the dashed line, which tells us that the relationship is significantly estimated and significantly greater than 0. So again, hours work and an increase in hours work of 1% translates into more than 2% in total carbon footprint, holding everything else constant. Somewhat similar picture for total ecological footprint. And again, similar picture for the energy use per capita. And this, actually, I'm moving faster than I thought, so it's good. Because this is the last slide, the slide before the last one. So this is a little bit augmented results. Again, I looked at all those four environmental indicators, but I've added a few more control variables like the urbanization rate on top of the population and GDP per capita to tease out also this composition versus scale effects, as Juliet is also describing it extensively in her papers. And the results are quite stable to those additions. And what I didn't have time to show you today, which is also part of the extensions that I'm running in this paper, is the investigation of heterogeneities across countries. So I'm also running some, I don't have the pictures here, but I can tell you verbally. I'm looking at some models, estimations, where I basically look at the distribution of the environmental indicator, let's say emissions, and see that distribution, and then estimate the same model across the distribution with quantiles. For example, the top emitters versus the lowest emitters, and how does the relationship between work hours and that environmental indicator is changing depending on where you are in the distribution of the environmental indicator. So far, that's what I have to show you. And indeed, I find some heterogeneities, just to say that, yeah. But I'm not perfectly confident about the results yet. That's why I didn't want to also share it widely yet, but it's coming out soon. So to conclude, basically, similarly to what's been done in the previous papers, now with the different data set and with larger time horizon, the empirical analysis seems to confirm this positive relationship between working hours and pressures on the environment. This is the case of EU at least, plus the 3 countries that I mentioned. And the relationship seems to be robust across different environmental indicators, emissions, footprint, and energy use, and also inclusion of additional control variables doesn't seem to change the results. It sounds like working time reduction is also beneficial. So not sounds like it's actually found, but I wanted to say on top of the environmental benefits, it's also beneficial for the well-being and work-life balance. So it sounds like a win-win for workers and for the environment. But as it's been also mentioned a little bit in the results of Juliet, some lifestyle and consumption patterns still matter. Working hours might decrease, but if those habits and consumption patterns do not follow, so then the positive effects on the environment might be limited, and there might even be some rebound effects. So I think, I mean, it's quite obvious, but I would at least highlight it again. Further empirical work at the specific country, and at the company level, with more, like qualitative data, I think it would be ideal and needed to complement this picture, because I see this more like a extensive margin of the issue, and then we also need to know the how, like how it works. The intensive margin of the issue is also quite important and necessary to have an overall argument, supporting our argument basically towards working time reduction. So I stop with that. I hope I was on time. And sorry for the screen and the sharing of the slides. I don't know what happens, but thanks.
Thank you very much. And that was perfectly on time. So we are going to start our Q&A. I will start with one question each, but then I also want to invite questions from our participants. So if you have any questions, please feel free to write them either in the chat, and I will read them out, or raise your hand. Please try to make it more of a question and less of a comment, mostly because with sort of time restrictions. I am going to start with one question for each of our speakers. So starting with a question for you, Juliet. Looking at that, so you have been looking now at the pilot where we are keeping the income fixed, but we're reducing the time. And I assume the aim there is to try to get behavior changes to reduce environmental impact rather than the sort of scale effect that is normally investigated. There is in the literature quite a little bit of a criticism towards keeping income steady because it lowers the sort of environmental benefit from work time reduction. Do you have any good arguments that can be used against that? Because of course, I mean, living standard has to be a priority. So if you could have a comment on how sort of keeping income levels up and still focusing on environment, I would really appreciate that. And for Meta, I have a question with the way that you've looked at this data. So when we're focusing on things like carbon emissions, and especially over the time period from the 50s to 2019, there's also been changes in how we produce things, and a lot of production has now moved to countries that isn't included in the data set. So often we tend to measure emissions based on production rather than consumption, which will skew the data and create the beautiful Kuznets curve, which might not be representative. Do you have any sort of thoughts on how we could look at that? Thank you. I think I also have a couple of questions in the chat, and I think we might have time to say them. A question here. Since the pandemic, there has been an increase in remote work, but recently we've seen a tendency to return to face-to-face work. Have any of you seen any measures of this return to the offices lately? And also a question here, what kind of environmental impact would you expect of an introduction of a universal basic income? So we'll stop there for now. And Juliet, do you want to start?
Or I just after I speak now, I'll take a look at our data set and see if I have an answer on the remote work. But so to your question, Alexandra, I have always taken the view that it's very unwise to try and reduce hours by with income reductions. And because people have, we know from a lot of behavioral evidence now, people have much stronger attraction to income that they already have than income they don't. So from I first wrote about this in like the late 1980s. You have to think about taking productivity growth, which hasn't yet been translated into income, and convert that to shorter hours of work. So this, as you say, this reform is different because it's not a productivity for income trade-off. It's actually a quote unquote free lunch that these companies are getting. They're figuring out how to be as productive. So I see it as the first step in a pathway to more rapid hours reductions, or in countries which really have sort of flatlined on their hours trajectory, to get it started again. So that's like my country, the UK, where you just don't have a lot of impetus for shorter hours. But I think we will never win on a program that says we're going to take away your income in order to address climate change. It's got to be a program that says you're going to be better off. It's going to be a healthier planet, that you're not going to be, having all the air pollution and all of those things. So you can expect environmental benefits or, carbon benefits from reducing workdays through the commuting pathway, because commuting is pretty energy intensive. And what we're seeing is, we've seen that in some of the compressed work week studies. So that we did expect some benefit from this reform that we're studying, although nothing like the larger impacts that METUP is showing in that research, which is really where you're trading income for time. So does that answer your question? And I'm going to look now while Metap is answering to see if I can answer the remote work. We're not studying remote work. We are collecting data on how much remote work there is in our sample, but let's see if I can come up with anything.
Yeah. Thanks for the questions. On your question on the that the emissions do not reflect the production, but more the consumption. So there is maybe a mismeasurement, or let's say, incomplete measuring of the environmental impact from the EU point of view. That's exactly why I've looked at the footprint, carbon, and the total footprint that takes into account this imports and exports. So that's taken care of with the alternative measures on the left-hand side. Then on the UBIs, the basic impact, incomes impact, I don't really look at that, so I cannot say much on this. I'm sorry. But I have something to share with you on the remote work. In another work, I've with colleagues from EQI and in Germany, Pamela Mile, we have written a chapter on the green transition implications of remote work. So it wasn't about work time reduction, but it was generally about, what kind of effects can we talk about? And similar to what Juliet showed when they were looking at the survey, we looked at mobility patterns, consumption patterns, transport, non-work travel, and so on. And what we found was the effects were actually quite mitigated, because on the one hand, people commute less to the office, but then there are many factors that come into play. So they live farther away. So the day when they commute, they travel longer distances. Then there is a rebound effect on the travel, non-work travel. And not necessarily going on a 3-day, like a holiday or something, but it's more like, for example, you might be going to short and separate trips, like to do shopping and then to pick up your child, whereas you would be doing this while you were commuting to work. So instead of, merging all those little commutes in one time, you do it separately. And that's apparently is shown to be bad for the environment, at least in some case studies that we have reviewed in this chapter. So if you're interested, I can share the link of the book that is edited by the EQI. So it's about the future of remote work. It has many aspects and perspectives about remote work. And the one looking at the environmental aspects is written by our colleagues and myself. So I'm happy to share this with you in the maybe chat or, thanks.
Thank you very much. I think, any resources. We are recording this session. So if we can also, in the same place as we upload that recording, share the resources that you are recommending, so they are available for people, because sometimes they get lost in chats and things like that, but it would be great. I have a couple of other questions here in the chat. They are both for Methap, so maybe then we can also return and see, Juliet Schor, if you've had a look at the data. But the questions are, these macro data include involuntary unemployment. So the question is different from Juliet's. So is the win-win message not overstated? A second question, there are many technological and economic impacts larger than those caused by work time. Have you conducted sensitivity analysis to study how including some of these in the models would change the results?
I didn't get the second question. The sensitivity analysis to what kind of controls? I missed that part.
Miklos, do you want to clarify? I will assume that they're referring to that there's been over such a long time. So Miklos, yes, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, so the issue is that we are looking at indicators that are influenced by many factors. And some of these factors are much more important than the effects of working time. So, for instance, changes in the energy system and similar technological things, or like certain economic changes, like the business cycles effects, are much more important for the outcome variables. So the question is it you try to include some of these, but obviously not all of these. So there are many, many technological factors that you haven't included like explicitly. And have you tried to look at the changes of the results of your model if you include some of these?
Thank you. Oh, so we have two questions there to Mehtab. Juliet, did you have a chance to look at the data, or do you want some more time? I wasn't sure.
Oh, yeah, just what we're seeing in the, I just had to go trial by trial, but there is in almost all of them, there's a reduction in the number of remote working days. So over this period, we've got people coming back to office, which makes the commuting findings even more powerful. The fact that people are spending less time commuting and less likely to be commuting by car.
Thank you very much. There are definitely some interesting things that are happening now when we're having changes to how we work and how people think around work. So Mehtab, you had a couple of technical questions. Do you want to answer those?
Yes, thank you, Miklas, for these very important questions. On the sensitivity analysis, you're right. I've been thinking about it, and that's also part of the extensions that I'm doing, but I didn't conclude them yet. That's why I also didn't want to share. But there is this complication, as you've also mentioned, about too many like confounding variables that on the side of technological advancement and etc. But yeah, it's impossible to put everything in regression, and then you end up having 1 million control variables. So that's not also the point. But I take your message there, and the thing that I've done doesn't solve it properly, like 100%. But there is the time effect. So that's at least the time varying dimension of these things will be captured by that. There are country-specific effects because you said also, for example, the energy system, what was the word? The mix of energy depending on the country. So that's evolving over time, of course, but there's also some country-specific aspect of it, depending on, the seasonal conditions or geographical conditions, etc., etc. So that is taking care of the fixed effect. Again, not a perfect solution, but it's definitely something that I have to perhaps think further to capture at least some of these effects that might blur the picture. And yeah, but it's very important. The macro data, it's the employment data set from classical macroeconomic data sources. So it probably includes involuntary work. But I don't have at this macroeconomic level, I don't have a way to capture it. I could perhaps see if I could distinguish this and maybe put it as a control variable. I don't think I can really measure this properly, but it's important. So I guess I have to at least nuance the interpretation. It's not a pure win-win strategy, but of course, I think we shouldn't also, look down on some benefits that we are seeing on the environment, despite some, some of the things that are happening that we are unfortunately not able to capture with macroeconomic data. So I guess I just have to take this into account, like be aware of it, but still don't kill the argument overall, because I think there is some evidence that is really supporting it.
I think you have some quite strong evidence there. Juliet, you wanted to make a comment on the data and then universal basic income, please.
Yeah, so on that last point, Miklos, come back. This is about your question on involuntary, if you don't mind, involuntary unemployment. That's not an issue here, because this is data from the firms, these working hours. So there could be some involuntary underemployment, but this is not, these hours do not, it's not population data, which would be depressed because of involuntary unemployment. This is data coming from the enterprises. So the
Are you talking about
unemployment.
Mechtap's model? Because the comment was to
Please do
Mechtap's.
not, please raise your hand if you want to say something.
Right.
Sorry, Juliet, did you want to continue what you're saying?
No,
Okay,
I
perfect.
didn't hear. Go ahead,
Go
Niklas.
ahead.
So I thought it was a misunderstanding that I asked the question from Mechtap because in her model the data includes, I think, those types of unemployment and not your entrepreneur data set.
No. I'm talking about her data. It's the same data I use. It's coming from the firm. So it's the average annual hours of work from the firms. So if people are on part-time schedules involuntarily, that would be showing up there, but not unemployment, only underemployment. Okay, so on the UBI, so it's really interesting because the standard economic sort of interpretation is that if you give money to lower income people, so if you have a redistribution from top to bottom, it will increase carbon emissions because you're going from people who save a lot to people who are going to spend it. And I've done work on this, looking at Gini coefficients and their impact on emissions, and there's no relationship. So this effect is not showing up in the data. Where you see a relationship between income inequality or wealth inequality, and I've looked at both, and emissions, is on concentration at the very top. So when you have more income and wealth concentration in the top 10, 5, or 1, you get higher emissions. So a UBI most likely would reduce, it might reduce emissions. I don't know, because the footprints of the people higher up in the distribution are much higher because they shift to really carbon intensive activities. And we've been seeing literature now on the super rich and the yachts and the private planes and all of that. So to some extent, it depends on how it's financed. Where is the money coming from? I think you can answer this question without specifying that, but I think the fears about UBI raising emissions might be a little bit overblown based on what we've seen in the literature. I mean, there is an argument there. But the other thing is, if you really want a more decarbonizing universal basic something, and autonomy is sponsoring today's webinar, so I will shout out to them for their work on universal basic services, because with UBS, if you provide low carbon services, you can have a much bigger impact than if you just give people money and let them spend it on anything.
Thank you all very much. I see that, Methap, you have shared the editor volume that you mentioned in the chat. We have a question. We're running a little bit out of time, and it seems like a short one. Is it possible to get the research report from the enterprises? So I think basically the interest is the data that you've been talking about today, Juliet, is that available publicly, or is it?
We have some reports that we've done. We're working on the academic papers now. Yvette, please just send me an email and I'll send you what I can.
Perfect. So I think that is going to have to sum up this session. There's been some amazing talks, some really interesting discussions. Thank you very much to both our speakers. Thank you to all our participants that have been participating and listening to today's session. We have another webinar in a month. India, do you have the exact date now? I can't at the top of my head.
It's the 25th of October, Wednesday the 25th of October, and it's going to be on winning working time reduction campaigns and coalitions.
Perfect. Thank you very much. I also just want to say, if there's any topic that anyone wants us to consider for a future webinar, please do let us know. These webinars are the outcome of the last meeting we had, where we heard this sort of demand for more specific topics to be discussed on a more regular basis. So please get in contact with us, let us know, and thank you all very much for participating today. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
So